purpose of this this talk today is to give you perspective on how we can get from a green vision of a government or private entity on a food park towards realistic or towards reality in terms of how we get there, how we build up such an industry park, and specifically around alternative meat and dairy, as we at Bright Green focus on this industry exclusively. Starting off, short intro on my end, but Gesa has already said one highlight is that I have worked on many projects at Bright Green, all the way from market entry strategies of FMCG companies to due diligence projects and commercial technical due diligence. Also, in terms of raw material market, raw material supply chain strategies and similar. One project, however, or not just one project, it was multiple projects after another, is most interesting, and this is a food industry park for alternative meat and dairy, consisting of many facilities such as plant-based meat, plant-based dairy facility, a biomass fermentation facility, a fractionation facility, microalgae, and most likely also a cultured meat facility. So combining different technologies in this field in an integrated greenfield approach is something I work on now for more than 1 year, and then hopefully can continue to work on this topic for a longer period. And I'm happy to elaborate a bit more on the next pages about this topic. Before moving into this topic, in general, what we've done, or what is always interesting at the beginning of each project, is to look at what is out there. And if we look at the spectrum of industry parks as not closed systems, but kind of systems on its own, we see there are different food parks, biotech parks, and other industry parks serving as great examples for the meat and dairy alternative industry. And there are different ways to build a food park. One is in the Netherlands, for example, the food cluster has evolved over many years and decades to a system which is organically grown. But there are also systems which are more inorganic grown, and I think the Singapore example is one where several stakeholders, of course, are involved, but the centralization of the planning is given to a higher degree compared to organic grown clusters. And this is why Singapore is such an interesting case, also from a circular economy perspective, looking at the central planning entities and how this is designed. But food parks are not the only parks I would look at or would recommend to look at when we talk about proteins. Also, biotech parks are interesting, especially when we look at precision fermentation systems or cultured cellular agriculture systems in a broader sense. We see that biotech park in Singapore, but also other biotech parks are interesting to look at for benchmark reasons. And last but not least, other industry parks. One interesting example is Iceland alumni industry. Iceland has no alumni, and the only reason why they have an alumni industry cluster is because they have so much cheap renewable energy based on geothermal sources, that because the alumni industry is a high energy industry, all the alumni is imported to Iceland, processed, and then exported. But the business case still adds up, and it's still an interesting concept. And the same principle could be also applied if we look, for example, at cultured meat, which is a really energy-intense production system. Of course, we need glucose, amino acids, and other raw materials as feedstock, yes, but we also need a lot of energy. And having access to cheap renewable energy in a stable way, in a consistent way, without the need for a lot of energy storage systems, is quite interesting. So this is what Iceland is bringing to the table, and this is why I would consider it also as an interesting example for the protein industry, or something to look out for. In every case, successful food parks have one thing in common. They are either close to consumers or close to raw materials, feedstocks, or other input factors like renewable energy. If you don't have any of these two factors, then it will be difficult to establish such a system and will be a bit more problematic. Even if you have access to these factors, it could be still you could still end up in the example of Malaysia with the Valley of Ghosts, where the government provided a lot of capex or a lot of investment, a lot of infrastructure, but this was not enough because incentivizing partner companies to operate facilities, you need more than just investment money and infrastructure. There are many more factors to consider, such as a good regulatory environment, a stable supply of raw materials like feedstock supply and similar, relevant joint venture structures, a good idea of how overall supply chain strategy also in terms of sustainability, but traceability and so on can work, and many of these points. So this needs to be considered as well. If we have looked at these benchmarks and think about, okay, what could, then the next question is, we want to build a food park system as part of a governmental program, basically, or as an example. And this food park needs to have a certain long-term vision, because if we think about building a food park, also if it's a smaller size, it will take some years from planning, engineering, construction, go live, ramp up, continuous operations. So with this long-term picture in mind, we need to have a good understanding of future scenarios and how they could look like. For example, in this case, if you look about food security and future protein production in a desert environment, then a combination of solar systems with microalgae facilities might be interesting, and also looking at access to seawater. If we look at another country and they think about cultured meat production, let's take the example of Iceland with a lot of cheap renewable energy and some good access to feedstock sources, then they might have a different concept in mind. Whatever the concept is, it's good to have this long-term picture in mind. But then moving on and seeing, okay, this is my North Star, this is my long-term picture, and now I need to break it down into what technologies are applicable today and what technologies will be applicable in the medium and long term. And also, if we talk about meat alternatives, there's, of course, at the moment, dry and wet extrusion technologies predominant as a pre-processing form. In the future, this might shift to more hybrid products, precision fermented ingredients with cultured meat and cultured fat ingredients and so on. So how can we make sure that the facilities are on the medium term operating on an economic base, but are also future ready for the long term? And these kind of questions are important to address as well in a food park concept. Just to show the complexity, what we assessed or what we looked into, I mean, it's not limited to these 3 dimensions, but if we just look at input, processing, output, we need to consider different value chain steps, different product categories, and different technologies. And really drilling down at this detail level to assess what makes sense to produce in a food park, in the system, what makes sense to outsource to adjacent facilities around the food park, and what is maybe outsourced to another country or imported in another way. But having this holistic perspective at the beginning is key to determine what are the USPs of the food park and the competitive advantages. And if we have, and the cube has showed this middle part, input factors, food sector perspectives, and output factors. If we look at this and considered what is on our value chain and how will it look like, then it's important to look at what is the cluster map, the ecosystem around it. And ecosystem is such a blurry term. I would like to break this down into what partner models do we need, what entities do we need, and which exact entities do we need, and at which stage of the food park development are these entities needed, and what involvement, so that we really break this down. 1 or 2 important factors to consider here is, one is that a central food cluster association is important to allow not only information sharing, collaboration, and communication and so on. This is important too, yes. But I would even go further. If we want to develop, if we want to move to a circular system, for example, producing meat and dairy alternatives in a circular setup, such a central food association should be also capable of looking at water management, energy management, waste management, packaging management, and all these things where individual operating companies face challenges to define a holistic system because they are limited by the facilities and the business they are operating in. But taking this perspective of individual companies, putting them next to each other, and then defining a holistic concept for this food park is essential. And this way, it's also possible to get to even more or to more circular systems and reducing waste, reducing inefficiencies, and allowing players to collaborate in a better way. But in order to do so, the central association needs to have also technical expertise, business expertise, and several expertise in addition, next to collaborating and information sharing. And I think this will be then the next level. At least this is what we also planned now in this example project. On the other hand, one other element important is to have a good storyline in place, which means when we want to attract partner companies, investors, talented workforce, researchers, and you name it, many different stakeholders, we need to have a very good storyline in place why this food park is designed on solid competitive advantages and solid USPs, and is a system which is interlinked and which is well functioning. And this way, it's easier to convince a lot of stakeholders to come to this food park and to collaborate with this food park. So the storyline element is quite essential and shouldn't be underestimated. What we've done in the project example, we planned it from the back, with the end in mind towards the input. So we look first at what are the outputs the food park should produce. In this case, it's a few hundred or 10,000 of alternative meat and 100,000 of alternative dairy products per year in a sustainable way, minimizing waste, optimizing for, of course, the business case, but also optimizing for sustainability from an ecological, but also from a social end. So this was the output definition on a high level. Of course, we broke this down further into concrete KPIs, concrete goals. But having the perspective of the output and the USP, then we can plan backwards and think, okay, which processing facilities do we need? First, we might need the most consumer-facing facilities, let's say plant-based meat, plant-based dairy. Then we move a step upstream the value chain, look at fermentation, precision biomass fermentation, fractionation facility, and so on. Cellular agriculture at a later stage, looking at technology development. And then we might also consider microalgae facility, potentially utilizing the CO2 from a fermentation, biomass precision fermentation facility. So then we have the sequence of the facilities. When does each facility will be planned from a business perspective, engineering perspective, and then detailed out in engineering sketches, the construction planning, ramp up, and the go live. And then within each facility, so if we take facility A, let's say the plant-based facility or plant-based meat, then we can think of, okay, how do we adjust the facility to the market demand we have in this respective region, in the respective country we operate in? Sometimes, if we look at a large meat, if the government or the entity is planning for a large meat, alternative meat, plant-based meat facility, then we need to consider that the market demand in the first years will not match the maximum size of the facility, which means a modular approach would be key in order to ramp this facility up over time. So not adding all the extruder lines at the beginning, but adding some extruder lines and then being able to extend the facility, extend the production line over time would be interesting. Future ready, I touched upon already. Of course, the technology mix should be changed or needs to be designed in a way that it's changeable over time, allowing for new technologies to be integrated. And then water, energy, raw material efficiency should be guaranteed. And then lastly, we look also at the ingredient side. So having a stable supply of raw materials, supply chains, potentially not starting with locally sourced raw materials at the beginning. If we imagine we build a plant-based meat facility first, and then we don't need to right away build a fractionation facility to create, let's say, protein concentrate, protein isolates for the plant-based meat facility. We might consider importing the, let's say, for example, the 55% protein concentrate initially as from another country or from adjacent facilities next to the food park, and then later on, once we have market traction, once the facility, the alternative meat facility is ramping up, we can build next to this also the fractionation facility, providing feedstock for later on. So these kind of considerations are then coming into play. So from the end in mind, planning towards the raw material supply chain side. If we have all the facilities in place and we have a perspective on all these facilities, then what we've did in this project, we said, okay, now we plan these facilities on European, North American standards. But we would, in order to have a circular system, we need to optimize quite a lot. And first, we designed it, or we planned it in two waves. The first wave is how can we optimize the, for example, solid waste, CO2 wastewater. These are just three examples. We also looked at building materials, equipment types, energy management, and other factors for a circular system. But these three types, how can we optimize the consumption and the process efficiency within the facility, reducing the waste, and then the remaining waste, how can we utilize this in other facilities? For example, the solid waste, using this as insect food, or the wastewater using this as fertilizer for microalgae greenhouses. And CO2 from the fermentation facility could be redirected, the remaining CO2, to microalgae and greenhouses. Of course, we need to look at the concentration level of the CO2 and many other factors, but this is the conceptual idea. So in the end, we end up with a nearly zero waste food park and a closed system. At least this is where we got at this project from a conceptual planning phase now. And the last page, and then we move on to the questions, is that if we have designed the vision, if we have designed the strategic USPs, the products we want to produce, the value chain, the technologies, and have a rough idea of the circular concept, then we looked at we already completed the program, the initial phase, to set it up, to have a certain idea of how the food park will look like. And then there needs to be the program management, governance needs to be set up. And then we need to detail out the market analysis, feasibility assessment per facility, but also the overall food park concept, the business model, business cases per facility and for the overall food park. And lastly, also the roadmap for the next 10 years. In this case, it's the roadmap 2030. And this roadmap is done on food park level for all facilities, but then also on facility level, breaking this down for each and every facility in the main project phases. And this will determine the next phases of looking for partners, looking for investors, looking for incentive schemes, operational planning and construction, starting with conceptual engineering, detailed engineering, then construction phases, and then of course the ongoing operations and the development to create a food park system which improves itself on an ongoing basis, having, for example, also research facilities on site, the startup accelerator, and other entities. Yeah, so this is the very high-level project plan for such a food park. Of course, this needs to be broken down to many sub-projects and work packages, and it requires a lot of time, but this is the rough idea. So this is where how you get from a green vision or a general idea of a long-term perspective from a government based on benchmarks, based on certain USPs which need to be fulfilled, like food security, having more jobs, economic prosperity, and so on, all the way to how do we create a food park as one entity. Of course, the food park is just one element in the overall strategy for a cluster or government to allow, for example, for food security, to allow for economic prosperity. But I would, from my perspective, it's a really tangible, practical element. And this way we move away from, we build an ecosystem towards a concrete production system, which allows us to work in closed loop optimized systems. And I think this way it's worth considering for a lot of countries and for a lot of private companies to bring this into discussions and to allow for more sustainable meat and dairy alternative production in the long term. This way, thanks a lot already for your attention. I added my email address on the bottom here. You can contact me anytime you like.